Welcome to Crossroads. The first known survivor of live organ harvesting in China has now stepped forward. This individual escaped a Chinese prison, and he recently revealed his story during a press conference in Washington. This case highlights one of the most brutal atrocities being carried out by the Chinese Communist Party, mainly against religious believers in China. And this case also has gotten fairly broad coverage in the news. It represents a significant development in exposing the human rights abuses of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, the Diplomat said this. They said in a chilling revelation that underscores the ongoing atrocities committed under the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, Mr. Cheng Pei-ming, the first known survivor of China's state-sanctioned forced organ harvesting campaign, spoke to journalist Tasmin Nazir for the Diplomat about his survival against the odds. And as this individual, Cheng, publicly shared his harrowing experience at a press conference in Washington, D.C. And they note that exposing his story and the ongoing forced organ harvesting that is taking place in China, his testimony offered a rare and disturbing glimpse into the horrors faced by prisoners of conscience in China, particularly practitioners of Falun Gong. They note that Cheng is said to be the only known survivor of China's forced organ harvesting, and his testimony is unprecedented in exposing the hidden horrors of the brutal industry. They go deeper into Mr. Cheng's story. Basically, he was imprisoned for his faith by the Chinese Communist Party. He was brutally tortured by the regime, including things like you'd see during the Inquisition, during of course, like the Spanish Inquisition or something like that. Just terrible things, torture racks, the whole 9 yards. He was tortured until he'd lose consciousness. When he'd wake up after regaining consciousness, the guards would torture him again until he'd lose consciousness again. And eventually he found himself shackled to a hospital bed with a bloody tube connected to him. He was subjected to various operations and weird blood tests. Blood tests, he would later find out, are the kinds you do when you want to do an organ transplant. He was tortured still, even then, physically and mentally. The Chinese Communist Party's agents are trying to force him to renounce his faith, and even using his family to try to pressure him. And eventually, he actually was able to escape. The story on this is very interesting. And he believes that he escaped basically the night before they were going to kill him. And the Diplomat had actually more on his escape. The Diplomat says this. They say he believes that the authorities were planning to kill him. That night before the scheduled surgery, Cheng requested to be unshackled to use the restroom across the hall. Upon his return, the guard, having fallen asleep and forgotten to reshackle him, inadvertently provided him with an opportunity to escape via the hospital's internal fire stairs. And he said, quote, "I noticed the fire escape on my way to the restroom, and I knew where it was, so I could use this to try to escape out of the hospital." He notes that he ran downstairs and called a cab in front of the hospital and quickly went out of the area into Tianjin City. And it's that Cheng escaped as a refugee to Thailand, where he stayed in a United Nations refugee camp. After a dramatic escape from China and a lengthy 9-year period of evading the authorities, Cheng made it to the United States in 2020. And so this was a very long process of him trying to get out. Now, he's actually now speaking about what's been happening. Let me show you what he had to say.
The reason I'm taking a stand today is because my friends who suffer persecution in prison in China can no longer make their voices heard. They've already passed away. We once promised each other whoever made it out alive would tell the truth to the public. My family members have been threatened. The CCP has employed a variety of tactics.
The case is particularly significant since researchers, they've been able to confirm that he was subject to forced organ harvesting during that time. Doctors came out, others came out. They, of course, looked at his wounds. They did analysis on him. They've confirmed his claims. The Epoch Times said this. They said in an August 9th press event, Cheng Pei-ming, a Falun Gong practitioner who turns 59 this month, recalled 6 prison guards pinning him down in a Chinese hospital to administer anesthesia against his will, while he was being held in a prison in northeastern China over his faith. And that day was November 16th, 2004. When he woke up 3 days later, he said, his right foot was shackled to a hospital bed. One arm was receiving intravenous therapy, and there were tubes on his feet and chest and into his nose. He began coughing nonstop and felt pain and numbness around his left ribs. And that's it only after escaping to the United States in 2020, a lot later, and undergoing a series of medical tests, did he confirm his worst fears. Part of his liver was gone, along with a portion of his lung. And as during a speech on August 9th, Cheng took off his shirt to reveal a scar about 14 inches long around the left side of his chest. And notes as well, to this day, his left arm and ribs ache on a rainy day when he's tired. And it's at the event, the organizers shared 3 assessments from medical transplant doctors who said the absence of organ tissue in Cheng's body could only have been the result of forced organ removal. They confirmed it. And notes as well, there's a deeper significance to this beyond his personal survival. He is living proof of a wider pattern of state-sanctioned persecution and abuse. Now, it notes as well that practitioners of Falun Gong, a spiritual discipline based on the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance, have long faced the threat of forced organ harvesting as part of the Chinese regime's all-out campaign to eliminate the faith. It notes as well that evidence of the systemic abuse first emerged 2 years after Cheng's forced surgery in 2006, when whistleblowers approached the Epoch Times with accounts of detained Falun Gong practitioners being killed for their organs in secretive Chinese facilities. Now, on this note, the Chinese Communist Party's practice of forced organ harvesting, it has been confirmed since then by independent researchers in many parts of the West, including during a London-based China tribunal back in 2019. It's also been condemned by several governments, including the US government. Right now, in fact, there's a bipartisan bill going through Congress that has already passed a House vote, and it looks to hold the Chinese Communist Party's agents accountable for this long-running persecution and also for forced organ harvesting. The bill is called the Falun Gong Protection Act. It's H.R. 4132. It was introduced by Representative Scott Perry of Pennsylvania. Let me show you this.
This bill is the first binding commitment by Congress to take strong legal action against the persecution and forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong, making Falun Gong the centerpiece of legislation, an action long overdue after 25 years.
Now, Epoch Times has more on this bill. It says the Falun Gong Protection Act, which still needs Senate approval, calls for an immediate end to the persecution. If signed into law, it will require the United States to shun any cooperation with China in the organ transplantation field and to deploy targeted sanctions and visa restrictions to address the persecution of Falun Gong on the international stage. Now, further in it states the Falun Gong Protection Act would also mandate sanctions on Chinese officials, military leaders, or others who are, quote, knowingly responsible for or complicit in or have directly or indirectly engaged in the involuntary harvesting of organs in China. Now, it notes as well that anyone on the sanctions list would be unable to enter the United States or engage in U.S.-based transactions and would have their current visas revoked. And notice as well, the bill also carries a civil penalty of up to $250,000 and a criminal penalty of $1 million and 20 years in prison for offenders. In other words, it would actually hold the Chinese Communist Party's agents responsible for this crime against humanity. And notice as well that under the bill, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and the Director of the National Institutes of Health would need to determine whether the persecution of Falun Gong constitutes an atrocity under the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocities Prevention Act of 2018 and find out how much U.S. grant money has supported organ transplantation in China. Something, of course, that has been happening with the medical cooperation with the Chinese Communist Party. Now, also, the timing of all of this is significant. Right now, as we speak, the Chinese Communist Party is launching a new campaign in an attempt to eradicate Falun Gong, even going after it in the United States. I'll be talking more about this after we come back from a quick break. Welcome back. A man escaped a Chinese prison and recently came out to reveal what happened during a press conference in Washington. Now, he had survived an attempt by the Chinese Communist Party to harvest his organs. In fact, doctors have confirmed that parts of his lung and parts of his liver were removed through forced organ transplant. And his story now, this is the first known survivor of organ harvesting. It's getting a lot of attention in the US press. And also this happens as the US Congress is looking to hold the Chinese Communist Party's agents accountable for the long-running persecution and also for the forced organ harvesting of religious dissidents in China, Falun Gong being one of the main ones, also including to an extent Muslim Uyghurs and House Christians. They've introduced the Falun Gong Protection Act, which just recently passed the House of Representatives. Now, the Chinese Communist Party since 1999 has been persecuting Falun Gong. It didn't have a reason to do it. In fact, the Chinese Communist Party did several reviews trying to find something wrong with it. Jiang Zemin, the former head of the Chinese Communist Party, said, find crimes, prove it's a cult. They came back and said, not only is it not a cult, but it's actually beneficial to the country. There were several reviews, several reports on this in China at the time. Jiang Zemin, the former head of the Chinese Communist Party, came out and said, well, persecute it anyway. And so what they did was launched a mass campaign of disinformation. They then used that disinformation to justify what is now just an ongoing persecution, where people have been detained, tortured, enslaved, in fact, through re-education through labor, and been killed in many terrible ways. One of the most widespread ones we're finding out now is live organ harvesting. Now, several news outlets have reported on this. New information is coming out on this. It's been proven to have been taking place. This is now coming out. It's now being proven as being true. And of course, as this happens, the Chinese Communist Party is trying to amp up its persecution. The timing of the introduction of this Falun Gong Protection Act in the US Congress, it's significant. The Chinese Communist Party right now is launching a new campaign in an attempt to try to eradicate Falun Gong. This includes an information campaign that was recently revealed by whistleblowers in China. They provided leaked CCP documents to the Epoch Times and to other organizations. And this campaign notably aims to feed false claims against the practice to foreign media and also to controlled online influencers. The Chinese Communist Party's information war, though, is also now getting exposed because of this. The Epoch Times noted this. They said the Chinese communist regime is manipulating Western minds and narratives in suppressing Falun Gong beyond China's borders. Researchers said in an event marking the 25th year of Beijing's eradication campaign against the faith group. It's for the past 25 years, Western media have repeated the Chinese regime's propaganda maligning Falun Gong. It's fake information from the Chinese Communist Party. And notes that editors and medical organizations have dismissed the validity of a body of evidence showing the regime is forcibly harvesting organs from political prisoners and dissidents in China. And notice as well that meanwhile, theaters in the West have backed off from hosting performances that shine a light on the regime's human rights abuses. And notes that panelists speaking at the Hudson Institute on July 17th cited those examples to demonstrate how the Chinese Communist Party has been conducting an effective global influence campaign. One of these individuals, Nina Shi, the director of the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute, told the Epoch Times it's a propaganda war. And she added that Americans who fall prey to such campaigns risk taking actions against the United States' own interests. Now, at the press briefing on July 18th, the State Department, the U.S. State Department, said that it has made combating these operations globally a priority.
We are very vigilant about the threat that of certain countries pose when it comes to spreading misinformation and disinformation, not just within their own countries, but in other countries. Domestically, here within the United States.
And as well, the State Department has previously warned against such efforts. And as well that Beijing, the CCP, spends billions seeking to create a global incentive infrastructure to get foreign governments, elites, journalists, and civil society into accepting the Chinese Communist Party's preferred narratives. And notes that the State Department stated this in the September 2023 report. And notes as well that left unchecked, that can create, quote, biases and gaps that could even lead nations to make decisions that subordinate their economic and security interests to Beijing's, surrendering, in other words, to the Chinese Communist Party. Now, there's actually been some arrests recently against alleged CCP agents working on these exact type of operations, including on U.S. soil. Just one example of this, there was a recent case in Florida. Tampa Bay Times said this. They said a federal indictment unsealed this week at the time accuses a Pasco County man of operating for years as an agent of the Chinese government, alleging that he provided information on political dissidents and American people and organizations to a Chinese intelligence service. It notes that federal agents arrested the individual Ping Li on charges of criminal conspiracy and operating as an unregistered foreign agent. Now, it's the indictment, which became publicly visible Wednesday at the time, of course, describes numerous contacts Li is alleged to have had with the Chinese intelligence officers based in the city of Wuhan. Now, it's that Li is an American citizen who emigrated from China, according to the indictment. And since at least 2012, he worked at the direction of Chinese intelligence to obtain information on Chinese dissidents and pro-democracy activists, members of a Chinese religious movement, and U.S.-based organizations. And notes as well that his attorney, Daniel Fernandez, declined to discuss the case, but said that Li had made a not guilty plea. He noted that the federal law under which he was charged encompasses a broad range of behavior. And notes as well, though, that because China places strict limits on the information that people can access on the internet, the government, the CCP, relies on overseas contacts to conduct research about the U.S. and other countries. They also use contacts abroad to monitor and intimidate Chinese political dissidents, according to the indictment. Now, it notes as well, this individual, Li, is accused of being a part of those efforts. It notes as well that his main overseas contact was an officer of the Chinese Ministry of State Security, who was identified in the indictment as MSS Officer 1. It notes he created numerous email accounts with false subscriber information to communicate with the officer. And the information he's alleged to have provided to Chinese officials includes details about American politicians and the internal operations of his employer. He is also alleged to have provided information about people affiliated with the Falun Gong religious movement. Now, the CCP has a lot of broad operations like this, not just in China, but even abroad and even right here within the United States. The CCP, it uses these networks to extend its human rights abuses onto U.S. soil. And part of this is the secret Chinese police stations we've been hearing about. These were found to be operating in other countries, including in the United States, including right here in New York, and notably as well, the U.S. government. They've been actually making arrests against individuals tied to these CCP operations. What the Chinese Communist Party has done is launch what they call a united front. Think there's a war, there's a front line in a war, and they're uniting their elements as kind of a front line in an unrestricted war against other countries. The CCP is extending its laws, it's extending its, of course, influence, but most importantly, or maybe just as important, it's extending its human rights abuses onto foreign soil using these networks. Because these Chinese information agents, right, these individuals going around, these influencers, what they do is this. They go into the high-level meetings of U.S. politics, they get into business circles, they go to the media, they start up nonprofit organizations, they talk to journalists, they feed them fake information, and they prop themselves up as legitimate China experts or people who say, hey, have you ever been to China? Do you know China? How dare you talk about China? Let me tell you what's really happening. And they feed them CCP propaganda. These individuals often work as direct agents of the Chinese Communist Party. These are referred to as agents of influence. And the CCP uses these types of operations as key parts of its influence campaigns to change foreign policy, to suppress religious groups, to go and intimidate people, to carry out arrests sometimes, including notably they had an operation called Operation Fox Hunt, where Chinese agents were actually able to operate in the United States and they were threatening to kill people right here in America or trying to get them to go back to China by threatening their families. The CCP does this on a very large scale. And these operations, notably, as we learn more about human rights abuses, as we learn more about live organ harvesting, this is getting the attention of the U.S. government, and they're actually going after these Chinese agents to try to stop these types of operations. Now, The human rights issues, they're important as well in terms of the growing conflicts between the Chinese Communist Party and the broader free world. A big part of the Chinese Communist Party's push to overtake the United States as the world leader is its promotion of the so-called China model. It's a narrative war. The Chinese Communist Party's human rights abuses are the weakest point in its narrative. And, in terms of diplomacy with the Chinese Communist Party, what it has done for years is it makes these human rights abuses no-go topics. If you're a diplomat and you're meeting with a Chinese diplomat and you bring up the persecution of Falun Gong, the Chinese diplomat typically gets up and walks out of the room. And by doing that, they've made it so that by establishing no-go topics, there are things that nobody dares to bring up. And because of that, they've basically silenced a lot of foreign governments on these key issues. What is happening right now is that governments around the world, they are increasingly showing a willingness to raise these issues. And with that, notably to expose the crimes against humanity being carried out by the Chinese Communist Party. This represents a massive shift in global policy because it means the free world is now no longer afraid of the Chinese Communist Party, getting up and walking out of a meeting. It means they're willing to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable for its human rights abuses. And they're no longer just going to let it slide because they want to make a business deal or make some kind of policy deal. It means they're actually standing up against the Chinese Communist Party on a value level in terms of what these actually represent in terms of systems. And the human rights abuses in China, again, that is the weak point of the CCP. For them, that is the greatest blemish on the China model system because it demonstrates the real nature of the CCP, that you can't have the China model without having this type of brutal persecution of anybody who sees a higher power than the CCP, anybody who believes in God and who believes there's something above the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP targets them, kills them, tortures them, enslaves them. Anybody who believes in democracy, anybody who tries to support values the CCP doesn't like, it looks to eradicate them. And free societies now are saying no more. They're standing up to it, they're calling it out, and notably, they're starting to expose it. Well, everyone, thanks for joining us. Let me know what you think in the comments about the CCP's persecutions and human rights abuses. Also, please help share this episode. Help us get the word out. As always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.